In court, my wife said, I built his life. I deserve his fortune. She asked for $15.50 million, half my company, and my family's estate. Everyone thought I'd lost, until I slid a folder to the judge and said, not so fast. Let me tell you something about rock bottom. It's got a hell of a view. And right now, I'm staring at mine from the cheap plastic chair of courtroom 4B in Denver County, watching my wife of 24 years try to financially castrate me with the enthusiasm of a Black Friday shopper going after a 75% off flat screen. My name's Mason Harrington, 52 years old, and up until about 6 months ago, I thought I had life figured out pretty damn well. Founder and CEO of Harrington Development Group, a construction company that's been keeping half of Colorado housed and happy for the better part of 2 decades. Got calloused hands, a decent reputation, and enough money in the bank to sleep soundly most nights. Or at least I did, until my loving wife Clara decided she wanted to take me for a ride that would make a Vegas casino blush. The courtroom's packed tighter than a rush-hour subway car, and I can practically feel the vultures circling overhead. There's Clara, sitting pretty as you please at the plaintiff's table in that navy blue power suit she probably charged to my credit card, looking like she's about to accept the Nobel Prize instead of trying to gut me like a fish. Her attorney, some slick-haired jackass from downtown Denver who charges more per hour than most people make in a month, is shuffling through papers with the kind of satisfied smirk that makes you want to introduce his face to the nearest brick wall. 24 years. That's how long we've been married. And apparently that entitles her to half my life's work, according to the legal brief that's been haunting my nightmares for the past 3 months. $15.5 million. That's what she's asking for. Not requesting, not hoping for, but demanding like it's owed to her. Plus half my company, the business I built from scratch with nothing but sweat equity and a prayer. Oh, and just for kicks, she wants my family's estate in Jackson Hole too. You know, the 160-acre spread that's been in the Harrington family for 4 generations, where my grandfather taught me how to fix a fence and my father showed me what it means to work with your hands. The whispers are getting louder now. I can hear them without even trying. Snippets of conversation floating around the gallery like toxic confetti. Poor bastard doesn't stand a chance. She's got him by the short and curlies. Should have gotten a prenup. Thanks for the brilliant insight, Karen from the 3rd row. Real helpful stuff. Judge Patricia Holbrook is presiding, and she's got that look judges get when they're about to make someone's day either really good or spectacularly shitty. She's been on the bench for 15 years, seen it all, and right now she's eyeing both sides like a referee at a prize fight who's wondering if someone's about to get their lights permanently turned off. Clara's lawyer, Peterson, I think his name is, though I prefer to call him that parasitic piece of shit, stands up and clears his throat like he's about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Your Honor, he begins, and I swear his voice has that practiced courtroom cadence that makes everything sound more important than it actually is. My client has sacrificed 24 years of her life building up Mr. Harrington's business empire. She's been the silent partner, the emotional support, the foundation upon which his success was built. I have to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Silent partner? The woman who couldn't tell the difference between a Phillips head screwdriver and a butter knife is claiming she built my construction company? Clara, who spent most of our marriage planning charity galas and complaining that my work boots tracked mud on her precious hardwood floors, suddenly discovered she was a business mastermind. Right around the time she started asking suspicious questions about our finances. Funny how that works. Mrs. Harrington, Peterson continues, gesturing toward Clara like she's some sort of martyred saint, deserves to be compensated for her contributions to the marriage and the business. She built his life, Your Honor. She deserves his fortune. There it is. The line that's been eating at me for months. Ever since Clara first had the balls to say it to my face during one of our increasingly hostile dinner conversations. I built his life. I deserve his fortune. Like I was some kind of pet project she'd been working on, a fixer-upper house she'd finally decided to flip for profit. The room's dead quiet now, everyone waiting to see how this particular train wreck is going to play out. I can feel eyes on me from every direction, some sympathetic, some curious, most just hungry for drama. There's my foreman Tony Vega in the back, shaking his head like he can't believe what he's witnessing. Martin Kane, my banker, is sitting 2 rows up, looking like he's already calculating how this is going to affect my credit rating. And there, Lurking near the door like the Grim Reaper's accountant is my business partner Lucas Browning, pretending to look supportive while probably already planning how to divide up my company once Clara gets her claws into it. But here's the thing about rock bottom that most people don't understand. It's solid. It's the foundation you build your comeback on. And while everyone in this courtroom thinks they're watching Mason Harrington get buried alive, what they're actually witnessing is the moment I stop playing defense and start playing to win. Judge Holbrook leans forward, her reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. Mr. Harrington, how do you respond to these claims? This is it. The moment of truth. Everyone expects me to either roll over and play dead or start screaming about the injustice of it all. Clara's already got that premature victory smile creeping across her face, the one she used to get when she beat me at Scrabble using words I was pretty sure she'd made up. I feel the weight of the manila folder in my lap, thick with documents that represent months of careful planning, investigation, and legal maneuvering. Inside are papers that will turn this whole circus upside down and inside out. But for now, I keep it closed, keep my cards hidden, because the best poker players know that sometimes you have to let your opponents think they're winning right up until the moment you clean them out. I stand up slowly, straightening my tie. The good one. The lucky one I wore to every major contract signing for the past 10 years. The courtroom holds its breath. Your Honor, I say, my voice calm and steady as Sunday morning. I have something to say about that. And as I tighten my grip on that folder, feeling the crisp edges of justice between my fingers, I can't help but smile. Because Clara, Peterson, Lucas, and every other vulture in this room are about to learn exactly what happens when you try to screw over a man who's spent his entire life building things that last. Not so fast. I continue, and the words hang in the air like a promise of things to come. You know what's funny about hindsight? It's got 20/20 vision and a real shitty sense of timing. Sitting here now, watching Clara play the victim like she's auditioning for a damn Oscar, I can't help but think back to when she wasn't this person, this money-hungry shark in designer clothing who's currently trying to legally rob me blind. Clara hadn't always been this person, and that's what makes this whole clusterfuck so much worse. Time was, she actually gave a damn about me, not just my bank account. We're talking way back, like dinosaurs roamed the earth back, to our college days at Colorado State University. I was 22, she was 20, and we were both broke as jokes trying to figure out what the hell we wanted to do with our lives. Picture this. Me, Mason Harrington, future construction mogul, spending my days as a construction intern pouring concrete and mixing mortar just to scrape together enough cash to pay for my civil engineering classes. My hands were permanently stained with cement dust, my back ached like I was twice my age, and my bank account had maybe enough zeros to be considered a phone number, a short one. But I was determined to make something of myself, even if it meant eating ramen noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 4 straight years. Clara was a communications major back then, which basically meant she was really good at talking. And trust me, that woman could talk the ears off a cornfield. She had this way about her, you know? Quick-witted doesn't even begin to cover it. She could walk into a room full of strangers and within 10 minutes have them all eating out of the palm of her hand, laughing at her jokes, hanging on her every word like she was some sort of charismatic prophet of good times. I still remember the first time I saw her. It was at some campus mixer that I'd only gone to because my roommate threatened to hide my textbooks if I didn't start socializing like a normal human being. There she was, holding court near the punch bowl, animated as hell, telling some story about her psychology professor that had half the party cracking up. She was wearing this yellow sundress. God, I can still see it clear as day. And when she laughed, really laughed, her whole face lit up like the 4th of July. What really got me, though, was when she noticed my hands. Those calloused, concrete-stained, beat-to-hell hands that I was always trying to hide because they made me look like exactly what I was, a blue-collar kid trying to claw his way up to something better. But Clara? She actually grabbed one of my hands during our first real conversation, turned it over, and traced those calluses with her finger like they were something precious. I love these, she said, and I thought she was bullshitting me. These hands mean you do real work. Not like these other guys around here with their soft little baby fingers who've never lifted anything heavier than a beer bottle. She used to brag about it, actually. Would introduce me to her friends as Mason, the guy who actually knows how to build things. like having hands that looked like they'd been through a wood chipper was some kind of badge of honor. Those were good times, I'm not gonna lie. Clara would come pick me up after my construction shifts, dust and all, and we'd drive around Fort Collins in her beat-up Honda Civic talking about our dreams. Mine were pretty straightforward: graduate, start my own construction company, maybe build something that would last longer than the cardboard boxes most contractors were throwing up. Hers were vaguer but ambitious, something about using her communications degree to make a difference, though she was never quite clear on what that difference was supposed to look like. She'd sit on the tailgate of whatever work truck I was borrowing that week, swinging her legs and watching me sketch out building plans on napkins. "You're going to be somebody big, Mason Harrington," she'd say, and the way she said it made me believe it might actually be true. Hell, maybe that's when the trouble started, when she first started seeing dollar signs instead of just seeing me. But somewhere over 2 decades of marriage, something shifted. Admiration turned into entitlement, and love turned into, well, whatever the hell this legal nightmare is supposed to be. It didn't happen overnight, either. It was gradual, like watching paint fade or your hairline recede. You don't notice it day by day until one morning you wake up and realize everything's different. Looking back, I can pinpoint when the first cracks started showing. About a year before we ended up in this courtroom circus, Clara began asking unusual questions. And when I say unusual, I mean the kind of questions that should have sent up more red flags than a communist parade. She started wanting to know about company revenue, insurance policies, equipment depreciation, stuff she'd never given a rat's ass about in all our years together. For a woman who'd spent the better part of 2 decades avoiding financial discussions like they were contagious diseases, suddenly she was Ms. MBA, wanting numbers, reports, projections. She'd casually bring it up over dinner, like she was asking about the weather. "Honey, how much did we gross last quarter?" Or, "What's the depreciation schedule on that new excavator?" At first, I thought maybe she was finally taking an interest in the business, maybe wanted to be more involved now that we were hitting our stride financially. What a fucking moron I was. She played it smart, too. I'll give her that. Never asked too many questions at once. Never made it seem urgent or suspicious. Just a concerned wife wanting to understand her husband's work better. She even threw in some supportive comments here and there. Stuff like, "I'm so proud of what you've built," and "I want to understand your world better." Classic manipulation 101, though I was too trusting, or maybe too stupid, to see it for what it was. The questions got more specific as the months went on. She wanted to know about profit margins on specific projects, the value of our equipment fleet, how much we had tied up in real estate and contracts. She started asking about my retirement accounts, life insurance policies, even the goddamn mineral rights on the family property in Wyoming. This woman who used to glaze over when I mentioned anything more complex than our checking account balance was suddenly interested in actuarial tables and asset valuation. I should have seen it coming when she started showing up at the office more often, bringing me lunch and chatting with the secretary about filing systems and document storage. She'd make small talk with my accountant about tax strategies and business structures. At the time, I thought she was being supportive, maybe even a little curious about the nuts and bolts of what kept us living comfortably. But Clara was conducting reconnaissance, mapping out my financial territory like a general planning an invasion. Every casual question, every innocent lunch visit, every seemingly random conversation about business practices was intelligence gathering for the war she was already planning to wage against me. The really twisted part? She was good at it. Damn good. She'd cultivated this image over the years of being the devoted wife who didn't trouble herself with the messy details of money and business. Everyone saw her as the woman behind the successful man, content to let me handle the complicated stuff while she focused on the social side of our lives, the charity events, the dinner parties, the carefully curated image of suburban success. Meanwhile, she was quietly building a case against me, documenting everything she could get her hands on, preparing for this exact moment when she'd stand up in court and claim she deserved half of everything I'd worked my ass off to build. The woman who once traced my calluses with admiration was now trying to use my own success as a weapon against me. That's the thing about betrayal. It's not just about what someone does to you. It's about who they used to be and who they pretended to be, and how those two people somehow turned into the stranger sitting across from you in a courtroom trying to destroy your life. Clara hadn't just changed. She'd revealed herself to be someone I never really knew at all. Friday nights in my world are sacred, and I mean that with all the reverence of a guy who's spent his entire adult life building things that last. Every week, rain or shine, sick or healthy, unless someone's literally dying or getting married, the same four idiots gather around my kitchen table for what we like to call therapy sessions. Though the Colorado Gaming Commission would probably call it illegal gambling if they knew about the cash pot we keep in the old Folgers can. There's Tony Vega, my foreman for the past 20 years, and the kind of guy who could build a skyscraper with nothing but duct tape, determination, and a healthy dose of creative profanity. The man's got hands like baseball mitts and a mustache that's been the same style since 1987, which he swears brings him luck at cards. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Tony's about as lucky at poker as a turkey in November, but he keeps coming back every week because, in his words, somebody's got to donate to the cause. Then there's Martin Kane, my banker since college, and the guy who's helped me navigate every major financial decision I've made since I was old enough to sign my own checks. Martin's the kind of banker who still wears suspenders unironically and knows the names of all his clients' kids. He's also got a poker face that could give Mount Rushmore lessons in stoicism, which makes him both the most dangerous player at the table and the most frustrating to read. And finally, there's Rick Dalton, my equipment supplier and the unofficial comedian of our little group. Rick's got more stories than a library and enough energy to power a small city. He runs the biggest heavy equipment dealership in 3 counties and has never met a joke he couldn't tell or a hand he couldn't bluff his way through. The guy could sell ice to Eskimos and convince them they needed the extended warranty. These 3 knuckleheads have been my closest friends for longer than some people stay married, and every Friday night we gather to play 5-card stud, drink beer that's probably too good for the occasion, and solve all the world's problems one hand at a time. It's better than therapy and cheaper than a shrink, plus nobody judges you when you need to vent about whatever's eating at you that week. So naturally, when Clara started her little fishing expedition through my business documents, these were the guys I ended up talking to about it. Not intentionally, mind you. I'm not the type to air my dirty laundry unless it's absolutely necessary. But when something's bothering you, it has a way of leaking out during casual conversation, especially when you're 3 beers in and holding what might be the worst hand in poker history. It was a particularly brutal night for my wallet. I'd already lost $60 and was seriously considering whether my pair of threes was worth throwing good money after bad when I made the mistake of thinking out loud. You know what's weird? I said, tossing my cards face down and reaching for my beer. Clara's been asking a lot of questions about the business lately. Revenue, equipment values, depreciation schedules. Stuff she's never given a damn about before. The reaction around the table was immediate and uncomfortable. Tony, who'd been in the middle of shuffling cards like he was trying to hypnotize them into better behavior, stopped mid-shuffle and gave me a look that could have cut glass. Martin's poker face slipped just enough to show genuine concern. And Rick, who usually can't shut up for more than 30 seconds at a time, went dead silent. Tony was the first to speak, and when he did, his voice had that flat, serious tone he usually reserved for safety meetings and funeral arrangements. He put the cards down, actually put them down, which for Tony was like a surgeon setting down his scalpel mid-operation, and leaned back in his chair. "Mason," he said, and I could tell by the way he said my name that I wasn't going to like what came next. When my ex-wife Maria started asking about the fleet value, how much the trucks were worth, what our insurance covered, 6 months later, her divorce lawyer knew more about my company than I did. The silence that followed was heavier than a concrete mixer and about twice as uncomfortable. You could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Tony's divorce had been uglier than a junkyard dog and twice as vicious, and we all knew it. Maria had taken him to the cleaners so thoroughly that he'd had to rebuild his life from scratch. It took him 3 years to get back on his feet financially, and even now, 5 years later, he still flinched whenever someone mentioned lawyers or alimony payments. Martin cleared his throat, which in Martin speak meant he was about to drop some financial wisdom that I probably needed to hear, but definitely didn't want to. "You know, Mason," he said carefully, like he was testing each word before letting it out of his mouth. "There are ways to structure your accounts that provide additional security. Asset protection strategies. Just in case." The phrase, "just in case," hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. carrying implications that made my stomach clench. Martin wasn't the type to suggest financial restructuring unless he saw storm clouds on the horizon. This was a guy who'd helped me navigate 2 recessions, a lawsuit from a disgruntled subcontractor, and the financial crisis of 2008. If he was bringing up asset protection, it meant he smelled trouble coming from a long way off. Rick, meanwhile, was staring into his beer like it held the secrets of the universe, which for Rick was unusual behavior. Normally, the guy couldn't stay quiet if his life depended on it, but now he was uncommonly contemplative. Finally, he looked up and asked the question none of us wanted to voice. How long has this been going on? Maybe 6 months, I said, trying to keep my voice casual, like we were discussing the weather instead of the possibility that my wife of 24 years was conducting corporate espionage in my own goddamn house. Started gradual, you know? Just casual questions here and there. But lately, it's getting more specific. Tony nodded grimly, like I'd just confirmed his worst suspicions. That's exactly how it started with Maria. First, she wanted to know about profit margins. Then equipment values. Then she was asking about retirement accounts and life insurance policies. I thought she was just trying to be more involved in the business side of things. How'd that work out for you? Rick asked, though from his tone, he already knew the answer. Cost me $500,000 and damn near everything I'd worked for. Tony replied flatly. By the time I figured out what was happening, she'd already hired a forensic accountant and had more documentation about my business than the IRS. Martin was nodding along like Tony was reciting gospel truth. I've seen it before, he said quietly. Usually starts with innocent questions about cash flow and business expenses. Then it escalates to asset valuation and equity calculations. Next thing you know, you're sitting across from a divorce attorney who knows your net worth down to the penny. The weight of their words settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't just friends shooting the shit around a poker table. These were guys who'd been through the financial wars and lived to tell about it. Tony had survived a divorce that would have broken lesser men. Martin had guided dozens of clients through similar situations. Rick had seen enough business partnerships and marriages implode to know the warning signs by heart. So what are you saying? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. That Clara's planning to divorce me? The looks they exchanged around the table told me everything I needed to know before anyone said a word. It was the kind of look men share when they're about to deliver bad news to a friend who doesn't want to hear it, but needs to anyway. I'm saying, Tony said slowly, that you might want to start protecting yourself before it's too late to matter. That night, I drove home with Tony's words echoing in my head like a warning bell. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, Clara already asleep upstairs, probably dreaming about whatever the hell it is that scheming wives dream about. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the house we'd called home for 15 years, wondering if my poker buddies were right to be worried. Turns out, they weren't worried enough. You know that moment in horror movies when the protagonist finally realizes the monster isn't hiding in the shadows. It's been living in their house all along? Yeah, well, that's exactly what Tuesday, March 15th felt like, except instead of some supernatural boogeyman, my monster was a 5'6" blonde in yoga pants who'd been sharing my bed for the better part of 2.5 decades. The day started normal enough. Hell, it started better than normal because I'd just landed the contract for the new Riverside Medical Complex, a $12 million job that was going to keep my crews busy through the next 18 months. I was feeling pretty damn good about life, which in hindsight makes the whole thing even more fucked up. There's something particularly cruel about having your world collapse on a day when everything else is going right. I'd left the house at 6:30 that morning, same as always, kissed Clara goodbye while she was still half asleep in bed, and headed off to the job site to break the good news to the crew. We spent the morning going over blueprints, logistics, timeline projections, all the nuts and bolts that turn architectural dreams into concrete reality. By lunch, I was feeling so good about landing the contract that I decided to take the afternoon off, maybe surprise Clara with an early dinner at that Italian place she likes downtown. So there I was, pulling into my own driveway at 2:15 in the afternoon, feeling like king of the world and planning how I was going to celebrate this latest victory. The house looked peaceful from the outside. Clara's BMW was in its usual spot. The lawn was freshly mowed. Everything looked exactly like it should in suburban paradise. If someone had told me that in the next 5 minutes I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage, I'd have suggested they lay off whatever they'd been smoking. I used my key like I always did, called out, "Honey, I'm home," like some sitcom dad, and headed toward the kitchen to grab a beer from the fridge. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but after 20 years in construction, you develop an ear for things that are out of place. A soft rustling sound coming from the direction of my home office, like papers being shuffled or moved around. My first thought was that Clara was doing some spring cleaning, maybe finally tackling the filing cabinet I'd been promising to organize for the past 6 months. God knows she'd complained about my system often enough, and by system, I mean shoving important documents into folders with the organizational skills of a drunk raccoon. So I headed toward the office with a smile on my face, ready to praise her for finally taking initiative on the paperwork front. The office door was slightly ajar, and I could see movement inside through the crack. I pushed it open gently, expecting to find Clara sorting through old invoices or maybe throwing away expired insurance policies. What I found instead was my wife of 24 years, crouched next to my filing cabinet with her iPhone out, systematically photographing contracts, financial statements, and business documents like she was conducting a goddamn FBI raid. For a second, and I mean just a second, I thought maybe I was seeing things wrong. Maybe she was organizing the files and taking photos to remind herself where everything went. Maybe she was trying to help me digitize my records. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation for why the woman who usually avoided my business paperwork like it carried the plague was now documenting it with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. But then she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, and the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't surprise or embarrassment at being caught making a mess of my filing system. It was pure, undiluted panic. The look of someone who'd been caught red-handed doing something they absolutely shouldn't be doing. She jumped up so fast she nearly knocked over my desk chair, her phone still in her hand, a stack of contracts scattered on the floor around her feet. For about 3 seconds, we just stared at each other like two gunfighters in an Old West showdown, neither one sure who was going to draw first. "Mason," she said, and her voice had that high, artificial pitch women get when they're trying to act casual about something that's anything but casual. "You're home early." I was looking for some tax records. Tax records. That was her explanation. The woman who'd been married to me for nearly a quarter century and knew damn well that I kept all tax documents in the fireproof safe upstairs was claiming she was looking for tax records in my active business filing cabinet. It was such obvious bullshit that I almost laughed. Except there was nothing funny about realizing your wife had been conducting covert operations in your own home office. Tax records. I repeated, keeping my voice as neutral as I could manage while my brain tried to process what the hell was happening. In my business files. Yes, well, I thought maybe you'd filed them with the business stuff by mistake, she said, still trying to maintain that casual tone even though her face had gone 3 shades paler than normal. You know how you sometimes mix up the filing categories. She was still holding her phone, and I could see from where I was standing that she'd been taking pictures. Not organizing, not cleaning, not looking for anything specific, documenting. Creating a digital record of documents that detailed everything from equipment loans to profit margins to client contracts. The pieces were starting to fall into place with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball through a china shop. All those casual questions about company revenue and asset values. All those innocent inquiries about depreciation schedules and insurance policies. The sudden interest in business operations from a woman who'd spent 2 decades acting like my company was some mysterious entity that operated according to rules she couldn't possibly understand. Clara hadn't been trying to be more involved in my business. She'd been conducting reconnaissance, mapping out my financial territory with the precision of a military strategist planning an invasion. And I'd been too trusting, or maybe too stupid, to see it for what it was. "What tax records were you looking for, specifically?" I asked, still standing in the doorway, still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, even though my gut was telling me I already knew the answer. She fumbled with her phone, trying to slip it into her pocket without being obvious about it, which only made the whole thing more obvious. "Oh, just the quarterly stuff. For the accountant." "Clara," I said, and now my voice was getting that flat, dangerous tone that my construction crews knew meant someone was about to get fired. "We filed our taxes 3 weeks ago." Bob Henderson had everything he needed months ago. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a circular saw. Clara's mouth opened and closed a few times like she was trying to come up with another lie, but we both knew the jig was up. There was no innocent explanation for what I'd just witnessed, no legitimate reason for her to be photographing my business contracts with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would make a private investigator proud. "Mason, I can explain," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said quietly. "Just don't." I turned around and walked out of that office, left her standing there with her phone full of stolen information and her mouth full of lies she hadn't had time to perfect yet. I went to the kitchen, opened a beer, and sat at the table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, where we discussed vacation plans and holiday arrangements and all the mundane details of a shared life. That night, lying in bed next to her, I watched Clara scroll through her phone in the blue glow of the screen, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. I was sharing a bed with a stranger. The woman next to me might have Clara's face and Clara's voice, but she wasn't the person I'd married all those years ago. That Clara, the one who used to trace my calluses with admiration, who used to brag about my work ethic to her friends, she was gone. In her place was someone who studied my life like it was evidence in a case she was building against me. The next morning, I called Gregory Miles, my business lawyer, and the guy who'd helped me navigate every major legal decision I'd made since starting Harrington Development. Gregory's one of those old-school attorneys who still believes in handshake deals and personal integrity, but he's also sharp enough to cut glass and cynical enough to expect the worst from people, which makes him exactly the kind of lawyer you want when the shit hits the fan. "Gregory," I said when he picked up the phone, "I need to see you. Today, if possible." "Sure, Mason. What's going on?" "New contract issues. Zoning problems. Divorce problems," I said, and the word tasted like ashes in my mouth. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that lawyers give you when they're mentally calculating how much your problems are going to cost. "How serious are we talking?" "Serious enough that my wife is photographing my business contracts without my knowledge. Serious enough that she's been asking questions about asset valuations and equipment depreciation for the past 6 months. Serious enough that I need to know what my options are before this gets any worse." Another pause, longer this time. When Gregory spoke again, his voice had shifted into full attorney mode, professional, focused, and completely devoid of the casual warmth he usually brought to our conversations. "Don't discuss this with anyone else," he said. "Don't confront your wife about what you saw. Don't change any banking or business practices until we talk. Can you be here at 4 o'clock? I'll be there." "Mason," his voice softened just a fraction. "I'm sorry. This isn't how anyone wants these conversations to go." "Yeah," I said, staring out my office window at the construction site across the street, watching guys in hard hats build something solid and lasting while my own life was apparently falling apart. "Me too." That afternoon, sitting in Gregory's office with its leather chairs and law books and diplomas on the wall, I got my first real education in what it means when a marriage goes from partnership to warfare. Gregory didn't sugarcoat anything, didn't try to make me feel better about the situation, didn't offer any false hope that maybe I was overreacting. "If she files first," he said bluntly, "the court can freeze your business accounts, put holds on equipment purchases, even force you to maintain the status quo on major contracts until the divorce is finalized. And if she's been documenting your assets for months, she's probably planning to file soon." "How soon?" "Could be tomorrow, could be next month." "But Mason, if she's taking pictures of contracts and business documents, she's past the thinking about it stage. She's in the building a case stage." I felt something cold settle in my chest, like someone had replaced my heart with a block of ice. "So what do I do?" Gregory leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and gave me the kind of look that lawyers give clients when they're about to recommend something drastic. "We get ahead of this," he said. "We restructure your assets, protect what we can protect, and make sure that when she makes her move, you're ready for her." As I drove home that evening, past the half-built houses and construction sites that represented years of my work, I realized that my poker buddies had been right to be worried. The only problem was, they hadn't been worried enough. This wasn't just about Clara asking suspicious questions anymore. This was war, and I'd just discovered that the enemy had been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and planning my destruction for months without me even knowing the battle had begun. Gregory's office felt different the second time around. The leather chairs seemed less comfortable, the law books more ominous, and the whole place had that last-chance saloon atmosphere that makes you realize you're not just having a friendly chat anymore. You're fighting for your financial life. "All right, Mason," Gregory said, spreading out papers across his mahogany desk like a general planning a military campaign. "Here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it fast because time isn't on our side." He outlined what he called my lifeline, though honestly, it sounded more like financial surgery without anesthesia. First up was something called Harrington Holdings LLC, a parent company that would act like a big umbrella over all my business assets. The idea was to transfer my equipment, active contracts, and commercial real estate into this new entity, creating legal separation between my personal assets and my business operations. "Think of it like moving your stuff to a different address," Gregory explained. Though his analogy made it sound a hell of a lot simpler than the mountain of paperwork he was shoving across the desk. Same belongings, different house. Much harder for Clara's lawyers to get their hands on. The second part of his plan involved something called the Harrington Family Trust, which would lock up my grandfather's estate in Wyoming tighter than Fort Knox. This wasn't just about protecting money. This was about protecting history, legacy, for generations of blood, sweat, and stubborn determination that had built something lasting in a world full of temporary bullshit. "This is crucial, Mason," Gregory said, his voice taking on that serious tone lawyers use when they're about to tell you something that'll either save your ass or cost you everything. "The estate isn't just real property, it's generational wealth. Once it goes into the family trust, marriage law can't touch it. It becomes untouchable by divorce proceedings." I stared at the legal documents, trying to wrap my head around the fact that I was essentially playing financial chess with my own life. Is this legal? I mean, this isn't hiding assets or anything shady like that, right? Gregory gave me the kind of look that suggested I'd just asked if water was wet. "Mason, this is asset protection, not asset concealment. Everything we're doing is completely above board, properly documented, and designed to preserve what you've legitimately built over 20 years of hard work. Clara's entitled to marital assets, but she's not entitled to destroy a family legacy or cripple a functioning business." The paperwork was mind-numbing. LLC operating agreements, trust documents, asset transfer forms, enough legal jargon to choke a horse. My signature started looking like chicken scratches by the third hour, and my hand was cramping from writing my name more times than a celebrity at a book signing. But every signature was another brick in the wall between Clara's lawyers and everything I'd worked for. While Gregory and I were busy playing legal Jenga with my financial structure, Clara's behavior at home was getting stranger by the day. She'd developed this habit of having lunch dates with women I'd never met, mysterious friends who apparently materialized out of thin air around the same time she started her little photography hobby in my office. She'd get dressed up for these lunches like she was attending state dinners, spending an hour on hair and makeup just to grab salads with her new besties. Then there were the phone calls, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked into the room, whispered discussions that sent her scurrying to the other end of the house for privacy. Clara had never been particularly secretive about her social life, but suddenly she was acting like she was coordinating covert operations instead of planning girls' nights out. The final red flag was her sudden interest in our joint accounts and credit cards. She started asking casual questions about spending limits, available credit, when statements arrived in the mail. For a woman who'd let me handle the finances for 2 decades, she was showing an awful lot of curiosity about our cash flow and available resources. I started documenting everything, not because Gregory told me to, but because some survival instinct kicked in that told me I'd better have records of Clara's increasingly suspicious behavior. I kept notes on her mysterious lunch dates, her weird phone calls, her sudden interest in our financial accounts. If this thing was heading toward a courtroom showdown, I wanted ammunition. The whole process took 3 weeks of legal maneuvering, paperwork filing, and careful asset transfers. By the time we were done, Harrington Development Group looked the same from the outside, but was legally bulletproofed from the inside. The family estate was locked up tighter than a Swiss bank account, protected by trust documents that would take an army of lawyers years to unravel. Gregory handed me the final set of documents with something that might have been a smile. "There," he said. "Your business is protected, the estate is untouchable, and if Clara wants a fight, she'll be fighting shadows instead of substance." As I drove home with a briefcase full of legal documents and a head full of new realities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for a war I'd never wanted to fight. But if Clara thought she could ambush me in my own life, she was about to learn that Mason Harrington didn't build a successful construction company by rolling over when things got tough. The storm was coming, but at least now I had shelter. You know what they say about keeping your friends close and your enemies closer? Well, turns out sometimes your enemies are so close they're sitting in the office next to yours, sharing your coffee maker, and pretending to give a damn about your success, while secretly planning to stab you in the back with a rusty butter knife. Lucas Browning had been my business partner for 15 years, 15 goddamn years of shared victories, mutual respect, and what I thought was genuine friendship. The guy was my architectural lead, the brains behind some of our most successful projects, and someone I trusted with everything from major client relationships to knowing where I kept the good whiskey in my office. If you told me 6 months ago that Lucas would be plotting against me, I'd have suggested you get your head examined and maybe lay off whatever prescription medication was clearly affecting your judgment. But life has a funny way of teaching you lessons when you least expect them, and apparently my education in betrayal was just getting started. It was a Thursday night, around 8:30, and I'd swung by the office to grab some blueprints for the Morrison project that I needed to review over the weekend. The parking lot was mostly empty except for Lucas's black Jeep Cherokee, which wasn't unusual. The guy was notorious for working late, especially when we had big projects in the pipeline. I figured he was probably putting the finishing touches on the community center drawings or maybe getting a head start on the hospital renovation plans. What I didn't expect was to hear voices coming from the conference room as I made my way down the hallway toward my office. Not one voice, but two. Lucas talking to someone in that hushed, conspiratorial tone people use when they're discussing things they don't want the rest of the world to overhear. My first instinct was to mind my own business and grab what I came for, but something about Lucas's voice made me pause. There was an edge to it, an excitement that didn't match his usual professional demeanor. It was the kind of tone guys get when they're talking about something they probably shouldn't be talking about. I found myself moving closer to the conference room, not because I'm some kind of paranoid eavesdropper, but because after 20 years in business you develop instincts about when something doesn't sound right. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Lucas pacing back and forth in front of the whiteboard, his phone pressed to his ear like he was conducting the world's most important business call. "The real value's in the client list," he was saying, and that got my attention real quick because our client list was the crown jewel of Harrington Development. 15 years of relationships, contacts, and repeat business that formed the backbone of our success. Once Clara gets her settlement, we'll undercut him and launch on our own. Mason doesn't suspect a thing. I swear to God, for a second I thought I'd misheard him. Maybe he was talking about some other Mason, some other Clara, some other business situation that had nothing to do with my life imploding in spectacular fashion. But as I stood there in that hallway, listening to my business partner discuss my personal destruction like it was a goddamn business opportunity, the pieces started falling into place with all the subtlety of a demolition crew. "The timing has to be perfect," Lucas continued, still pacing like a caged animal. "We let the divorce play out. Let Clara take her chunk. Then we swoop in and offer services to his clients at 20% below his rates. Most of them will jump ship, especially the ones who've been complaining about his pricing." My chest went cold, like someone had opened a freezer door directly into my ribcage. This wasn't just business competition. This was calculated betrayal by someone who knew every detail of my operation, every client relationship I'd spent years building, every strength and weakness of Harrington Development. "The beauty of it is that Mason trained me on everything," Lucas said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the smug confidence of someone who thought he was outsmarting everybody else in the room. "I know his systems, his processes, his client preferences. Hell, I designed half the projects he's been taking credit for over the past 5 years." That last comment hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. Taking credit for his work? I'd made Lucas a full partner precisely because I valued his contributions to the company. His name was on every proposal, every drawing, every project he'd worked on. The guy had profit sharing, decision-making authority, and recognition for every success we'd achieved together. But apparently, in his mind, he was some unappreciated genius being held back by his incompetent partner. "How long until Clara files?" he asked, and I realized he wasn't just talking to himself. Someone was on the other end of that phone call, someone who apparently knew more about my personal situation than I was comfortable with. There was a pause while he listened to whoever was feeding him information about my marriage, my finances, my life. Then Lucas laughed. Actually laughed, like the destruction of everything I'd worked for was the funniest joke he'd heard all week. "Perfect," he said. "That gives us time to line up financing and start reaching out to key clients. By the time Mason realizes what's happening, we'll already have half his business locked up." I backed away from that conference room like I was retreating from a crime scene, my heart pounding so hard I was surprised Lucas couldn't hear it through the walls. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. This was a full-scale conspiracy involving my wife and my business partner, the two people who should have had my back no matter what. The drive home was a blur of rage, disbelief, and the kind of cold fury that settles in your bones when you realize just how thoroughly you've been played. I kept replaying Lucas's words in my head, analyzing every interaction we'd had over the past few months, looking for signs I should have caught earlier. All those late-night strategy sessions where Lucas insisted on taking detailed notes about client preferences and project timelines. All those casual questions about profit margins and pricing strategies. All those times he'd offered to help Clara understand the business side of things when she started showing interest in company operations. The son of a bitch had been conducting his own reconnaissance mission, mapping out my business relationships while pretending to be my trusted partner. When I walked into my house that night, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, probably researching divorce attorneys or calculating how much money she could squeeze out of our marriage. She looked up when I came in, gave me that fake smile she'd been practicing lately, and asked how my day went. "Just great," I said, forcing myself to act normal even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to confront her about Lucas, about the phone call, about the entire elaborate scheme they'd apparently been cooking up behind my back. "Lucas is working late again, really dedicated to the company." "That's nice," she said, already turning back to her laptop screen. "He's always been such a hard worker." "Yeah," I thought as I headed upstairs to pour myself a drink strong enough to kill the taste of betrayal. "He's working hard, all right. Working hard to destroy everything we've built together." That night, lying in bed next to my scheming wife, while my treacherous business partner probably planned our mutual destruction from his office down the hall, I realized that the war I'd been preparing for was bigger than I'd imagined. It wasn't just about protecting my assets from Clara's divorce demands. It was about surviving a coordinated attack from the two people I'd trusted most in the world. But here's the thing about construction work. It teaches you that the strongest foundations are built to withstand earthquakes, floods, and storms that would flatten weaker structures. And after 20 years of building things that last, I wasn't about to let a couple of backstabbing amateurs bring down everything I'd worked for. The gloves were officially off. When your lawyer suggests hiring a private investigator, you know your life has officially jumped the rails and headed straight into Jerry Springer territory. But that's exactly where I found myself the Monday morning after discovering Lucas's little conspiracy phone call, sitting in Gregory's office while he explained why I needed to fight fire with fire. "Mason, if Clara's been planning this for months, she's got more documentation than we know about," Gregory said, leaning back in his chair with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too many marriages implode. "We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before she files. And honestly, if Lucas is involved, this could get uglier than either of us anticipated." That's how I ended up getting introduced to Patricia Russo, a private investigator who looked like she could bench press a Buick and had the kind of no-nonsense attitude that made you believe she'd done this rodeo a few hundred times before. Patricia had been recommended by Gregory's firm, and her reputation apparently included exposing financial fraud, documenting infidelity, and generally making life miserable for people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Our first meeting was at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where business people go to have conversations they don't want overheard in their offices. Patricia showed up wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and an expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind about what kind of case this was going to be. "Let me guess," she said before I'd even finished explaining the situation. Wife starts asking unusual questions about business finances, suddenly has new friends you've never met, becomes secretive about phone calls and lunch dates. Meanwhile, your business partner begins showing increased interest in company operations and client relationships. Am I close? The accuracy of her assessment was unsettling, like she'd been watching my life unfold from the sidelines. Yeah, that's pretty much it. How do you know? Patricia gave me a smile that had zero warmth in it. Because I've seen this exact scenario about 50 times in the past 10 years. The details change, but the pattern's always the same. Question is, how deep do you want me to dig? As deep as necessary, I said, surprised by how quickly the words came out. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a happily married construction company owner who thought his biggest problem was whether to bid on the new shopping center project. Now I was hiring private investigators to spy on my wife and business partner. Life comes at you fast sometimes. Patricia's approach was methodical and thorough, like watching a master craftsman work with tools I didn't understand. She started with public records, court filings, business registrations, property transfers, anything that might show patterns of behavior or financial planning. Then she moved on to social media surveillance, tracking Clara's online activity and cross-referencing her new friends with divorce attorneys and financial planners. Your wife's been busy, Patricia told me during our first check-in call about a week into her investigation. She's had lunch meetings with 3 different divorce attorneys over the past 2 months. Also been researching forensic accountants and asset valuation specialists. The confirmation hit me like a punch to the stomach, even though I'd known it was coming. Hearing it out loud made it real in a way that all my suspicions and paranoia hadn't. Clara wasn't just thinking about divorce. She was building a war chest. How long has this been going on? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Based on what I've found so far, at least a year. Maybe longer. This isn't a recent decision, Mason. This is a long-term strategy. A year. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to build our financial security, Clara had been spending that entire time planning how to take half of it and walk away. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined, rooted in months of deception and calculated planning. But Patricia wasn't done delivering bad news. 2 weeks into her investigation, she called me with the kind of update that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the people in your life. I've got photos, she said simply. You're not going to like them. We met at the same coffee shop, and Patricia slid a manila envelope across the table like she was passing classified documents. Your wife and Lucas Browning, she said. Laramie Restaurant, last Tuesday. Also hotel receipts from the Hampton and dating back 4 months. I opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady, and there they were, clear, undeniable photographs of Clara and Lucas having what was obviously not a business lunch. The body language, the intimate conversation, the way they were leaning toward each other across the table. It told a story I didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. There's more, Patricia said, sliding another set of documents across the table. Copies of confidential Harrington development contracts found in Lucas's personal files. Client lists, pricing strategies, profit margins, information he shouldn't have access to outside the office. The scope of their betrayal was breathtaking. Not only had Clara been planning to divorce me and take half my assets, but she'd been working with Lucas to systematically document and steal my business information. They weren't just destroying my marriage. They were positioning themselves to destroy my company too. How long? I asked, staring at photographs that showed my wife and business partner looking at each other like lovesick teenagers instead of co-conspirators planning financial warfare. The affair started about 6 months ago, based on hotel records and credit card activity. But the business intelligence sharing goes back further, almost a year. Lucas has been feeding Clara information about company operations since before their romantic relationship began. So it hadn't started as an affair that turned into business betrayal. It had started as business betrayal that turned into an affair. Somehow, that made it worse. They'd begun by conspiring against me professionally, then decided to add personal betrayal to the mix for good measure. What's their endgame? I asked, though I was starting to piece together the answer myself. Patricia laid out their strategy with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a complex operation. Clara files for divorce, demands half your assets including significant portions of the business. During the legal proceedings, Lucas positions himself as the stable partner who can keep operations running. Once the settlement is finalized and you're financially weakened, they launch their own firm using your client list, your business relationships, and your operational knowledge. Can they do that legally? The affair and the asset theft and divorce proceedings? Probably not. But starting a competing business using information Lucas legitimately had access to as your partner? That's going to be harder to prove in court, especially if they're smart about how they approach your former clients. I sat there in that coffee shop, surrounded by the normal sounds of people living their normal lives, while Patricia systematically destroyed every assumption I'd had about my marriage and my business partnership. The photographs, the hotel receipts, the copied contracts, it was all evidence of a level of betrayal I'd never imagined possible from people I'd trusted completely. But as Patricia packed up her files and prepared to leave, she said something that cut through my shock and anger like a knife through butter. "Mason, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of people get destroyed by situations like this. But I've also seen people come out stronger on the other side. The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" As I drove home that afternoon, Patricia's evidence sitting in the passenger seat like a loaded weapon, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let Clara and Lucas's betrayal break me, or I could use their own deception against them. They thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how far Mason Harrington was willing to go to protect what he'd built. The war was about to begin, and thanks to Patricia Russo, I finally had ammunition. Some nights, when the weight of betrayal sits on your chest like a concrete slab and sleep feels about as likely as winning the lottery, you need to go somewhere that reminds you who you really are. For me, that place has always been the family estate in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, 160 acres of high country that's been in Harrington hands since my great-grandfather first staked his claim back when Wyoming was still figuring out what it wanted to be when it grew up. The drive from Denver takes about 6 hours if you don't stop for anything but gas and bathroom breaks. And that Thursday night, I made it in 5.5 because I had a lot of thinking to do and an empty highway stretching out in front of me like a promise of temporary peace. Patricia's envelope of evidence was sitting in my passenger seat, a manila folder full of proof that my wife and business partner had been screwing me over in every way imaginable, and I needed to be somewhere that made sense before I decided how to use it. The estate sits in a valley between two ridgelines, accessible by a gravel road that winds through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen trees that turn the whole mountainside into a goddamn postcard every fall. It's the kind of place that makes city folks want to quit their jobs and become cowboys, at least until they realize that ranching involves a lot more cow shit and early mornings than their romantic fantasies included. I pulled up to the main cabin around midnight, my headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the log structure my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1952. The place looks exactly like what it is, a working ranch house built by a man who understood that things should be constructed to last longer than the people who build them. Solid timber frame, stone foundation, metal roof that can handle anything Mother Nature throws at it. No fancy architectural flourishes or designer touches. Just honest construction that's been standing strong for over 70 years. The cabin's been updated over the decades. Of course, electricity, plumbing, modern appliances, all the conveniences that make life bearable for people who've gotten used to civilization. But the bones of the place are exactly the same as they were when my grandfather first chinked the logs and hung the door. Every summer growing up, I'd spend weeks here learning how to mend fences, work cattle, and understand the difference between building something that looks good and building something that lasts. Walking through that front door always feels like stepping back in time, not because the place is stuck in the past, but because it represents something timeless, the idea that a man's legacy isn't just about how much money he makes, but about what he leaves behind for the people who come after him. The living room still has the massive stone fireplace my grandfather built. The kitchen still has the oak table where 4 generations of Harringtons have eaten meals and made plans and argued about everything from cattle prices to politics. I grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, built a fire in the fireplace, and sat in my grandfather's old leather chair to think about what the hell I was going to do with the information Patricia had given me. The photographs of Clara and Lucas, the hotel receipts, the evidence of stolen business documents. It was enough to destroy both of them in court. But using it would mean admitting to the world that I'd been played for a fool by the two people I'd trusted most. That's when I started thinking about my grandfather, Samuel Harrington, and the stories I'd grown up hearing about how he built this place from nothing. He'd come to Wyoming in 1950 with a pregnant wife, $200 in his pocket, and a determination to create something lasting in a part of the country that didn't make things easy for dreamers. He'd worked construction jobs in Jackson during the week and spent his weekends clearing land, cutting timber, and laying the foundation for what would become the family ranch. By the time my father was old enough to swing a hammer, Grandpa Sam had turned those 160 acres into a working cattle operation that supported 3 families and employed half a dozen local hands during busy seasons. He'd built not just the main cabin, but a barn, equipment sheds, guest quarters, and miles of fence line that still mark the property boundaries today. More importantly, he'd built a reputation for integrity that made the Harrington name mean something in this part of Wyoming. My father had carried on that tradition, expanding the operation and adding modern conveniences while maintaining the ranch's character and values. He'd taught me that land ownership isn't just about having a place to live. It's about being a caretaker for something bigger than yourself, something that connects you to both the past and the future in ways that stock portfolios and bank accounts never could. Now Clara wanted to take it all away as part of her divorce settlement. The woman who'd spent our entire marriage complaining about that dusty old ranch and asking when we were going to sell it suddenly saw it as a valuable asset worth fighting for. She didn't understand that the estate wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, family history, the sweat and sacrifice of 3 generations of men who'd built something meaningful in a world full of temporary bullshit. I walked outside into the crisp mountain air, looking up at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and made a decision that would change everything. Clara and Lucas wanted to play hardball. They wanted to use my own trust and loyalty against me. Fine. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how far I was willing to go to protect what really mattered. Standing there in the darkness, surrounded by land that had been in my family for generations, I realized that I had 2 choices. I could fight this battle on their terms, using Patricia's evidence to expose their affair and business theft in a messy court proceeding that would destroy all of us. Or I could fight it on my terms, using their own greed and overconfidence against them while protecting what couldn't be replaced. The estate was already protected by the family trust Gregory had set up, but Clara didn't know that yet. As far as she was concerned, the ranch was still part of the marital assets she could claim in divorce proceedings. That gave me an advantage. She'd be fighting for something she couldn't actually get, while I'd be protecting something she couldn't actually touch. But the real inspiration came when I started thinking about the rest of my assets, the business holdings and financial accounts that Clara and Lucas were so carefully documenting and planning to divide between them. What if they got exactly what they wanted? What if Clara's divorce settlement gave her everything she was demanding, and Lucas got the partnership position he was maneuvering for? What if I gave them both exactly what they thought they wanted, and let them discover too late that they'd been fighting over illusions? The next morning, I walked the property boundaries, following fence lines my grandfather had built and my father had maintained, thinking about the difference between things that have value and things that are valuable. Clara wanted the ranch because she saw it as an asset worth millions on paper, but she'd never understood that its real value wasn't in what it could be sold for. It was in what it represented, the history and heritage that made it irreplaceable. I spent the day checking cattle, mending fence, and doing the kind of physical work that clears your head and reminds you what really matters. By evening, I made up my mind about how this war was going to end. Clara and Lucas thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers, but they were wrong about who was really controlling the game. I called Gregory from the cabin's landline, the same phone my father had used to conduct ranch business for 30 years. "Gregory, it's Mason. I've been thinking about our strategy, and I want to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that are going to give Clara and Lucas exactly what they want," I said, watching the sun set behind the mountains my great-grandfather had first seen more than 70 years ago, and make them regret ever wanting it. The plan that formed in my mind that night was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting Clara's demands, I'd agree to them, on paper. She wanted half my assets. She could have them. Lucas wanted to position himself as the stable partner who could keep the business running. Perfect. Let him think he was getting everything he'd schemed for. But when the dust settled and the legal documents were signed, they discovered that they'd been fighting over empty shells while the real assets, the things that actually mattered, remained safely out of their reach. The business they thought they were inheriting would be a hollow corporation with no real value. The accounts they thought they were splitting would contain a fraction of what they expected. The estate they thought they were claiming would be locked away in trust, untouchable by divorce proceedings or business partnerships. I'd let them think they'd won right up until the moment they realized they'd lost everything that actually mattered. It was a risky strategy, one that required me to look weak while positioning myself to be strong, to appear defeated while actually claiming victory. But as I sat in my grandfather's chair that night, surrounded by 4 generations of Harrington history, I knew it was the right choice. Clara and Lucas had tried to use my trust against me, my loyalty as a weapon to destroy everything I'd built. Now they were going to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning right up until the moment you discover you've lost everything. The estate would remain in Harrington hands, where it belonged. The business would survive their betrayal, stronger than before. And Clara and Lucas would learn the hard way that there's a difference between being smart and being wise, between winning battles and winning wars. I drove back to Denver the next morning with a clear head and a concrete plan, ready to give my wife and business partner exactly what they thought they wanted. They'd spent months planning my destruction, documenting my assets, and positioning themselves to benefit from my downfall. Now it was time to show them what real strategy looked like. Judgment Day arrived with all the fanfare of a public execution, which in a way, I guess it was. The courtroom was packed tighter than a sardine can, filled with curious onlookers, legal vultures, and people who apparently had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning than watch a man's life get dissected in front of a judge. Clara had made sure to invite an audience, friends, family members, even some of my business associates who she'd somehow convinced to show up for what she probably described as her big day. Clara looked like she was about to accept an Academy Award rather than attempt grand larceny in a court of law. She'd chosen this tailored black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her hair was done up in some complicated style that required professional intervention, and she had this satisfied glow about her that made it clear she thought victory was already in the bag. Every few minutes, she'd turn to whisper something to her high-priced Denver attorney, Peterson, and they'd both nod like they were discussing the finer points of her inevitable triumph. Lucas was lurking in the back of the courtroom like some kind of legal carrion bird, trying to look supportive while probably calculating how quickly he could start poaching my clients once Clara got her settlement. The bastard had the nerve to give me a sympathetic nod when our eyes met, like he was just an innocent bystander instead of one of the architects of this whole clusterfuck. I had to resist the urge to walk over there and introduce his face to the nearest wall, but I'd learned patience over the past few months, the kind of patience that comes from knowing you're about to watch your enemies destroy themselves. Judge Holbrook called the session to order, and Peterson launched into his closing argument with all the theatrical flair of a Shakespearean actor performing for the cheap seats. He painted Clara as the long-suffering wife who'd sacrificed her own dreams to support her husband's ambitions, the unsung hero behind Harrington Development's success, the woman who deserved to be compensated for 24 years of devotion and partnership. "Your Honor," Peterson declared, gesturing toward Clara like she was some kind of martyred saint, "Mrs. Harrington has given the best years of her life to building Mr. Harrington's business empire. She's been the emotional support, the social coordinator, the foundation upon which his success was built. Without her contributions, Harrington Development would never have achieved its current level of prosperity." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Clara, the foundation of my business success? The woman who thought a Phillips head screwdriver was some kind of exotic cocktail ingredient was claiming credit for a construction company's achievements? The same Clara who'd spent most of our marriage planning charity galas and complaining that my work boots tracked mud on her precious hardwood floors was suddenly a business mastermind who deserved half of everything I'd built with my own hands? Peterson continued his performance, outlining Clara's demands with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a game show host announcing the grand prize. $15.5 million in cash and liquid assets. 50% ownership of Harrington Development Group. Complete ownership of the family estate in Jackson Hole. including all mineral rights and future development potential. It was a shopping list designed to leave me financially castrated and professionally humiliated. The courtroom was dead silent as Peterson laid out the scope of Clara's demands, and I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Some sympathetic, some curious, most just hungry for drama. There was Tony Vega shaking his head in disbelief, Martin Kane looking like he was already calculating the financial damage, and Rick Dalton wearing the expression of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. But here's what none of them knew, what Clara and Lucas and Peterson couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. I was about to give Clara exactly what she wanted. Every penny, every asset, every demand on her ridiculous wish list. Because sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy think they've already won the battle. Judge Holbrook leaned forward, her reading glasses reflecting the fluorescent courtroom lights. Mr. Harrington, you've heard Mrs. Harrington's demands for division of marital assets. How do you respond to these claims? This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for since that night at the family estate when I decided to fight this war on my terms instead of theirs. The moment when Clara and Lucas would think they'd achieved total victory, right before they discovered they'd been played by someone who understood the difference between appearance and reality. I stood up slowly, straightening my tie. The good one, the lucky one I'd worn to every major contract signing for the past 10 years. The courtroom held its breath, probably expecting me to either beg for mercy or launch into some desperate defense of my life's work. Instead, I did something that shocked everyone in that room, including my own lawyer. Your Honor, I said, my voice calm and steady as Sunday morning. I don't contest Mrs. Harrington's demands. In fact, I agree to all of them. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Clara's victorious smile bloomed across her face like a flower opening to sunlight. Lucas actually grinned from his position in the back, probably already mentally drafting business plans for our new partnership. Peterson started scribbling notes furiously, no doubt calculating his percentage of the settlement and planning his victory press conference. But then I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the manila folder that had been sitting there like a loaded weapon, waiting for exactly this moment. I slid it across the table to Judge Holbrook with the casual confidence of a man who'd been holding 4 aces while everyone else fought over the ante. However, Your Honor, I continued, I believe the court should be aware of some additional information that may affect the final settlement terms. The folder contained everything Patricia Russo had discovered during her investigation. Photographs of Clara and Lucas together, hotel receipts documenting their affair, copies of confidential business documents that Lucas had illegally shared, and a detailed timeline of their conspiracy that went back over a year. But more importantly, it contained the corporate restructuring documents that Gregory had prepared, proving that most of the assets Clara was demanding had already been legally transferred to entities she couldn't touch. Judge Holbrook opened the folder, and I watched her expression change from judicial neutrality to genuine surprise to something that looked suspiciously like anger. She studied the documents for what felt like an eternity while the courtroom waited in confused silence. Clara's confident smile was starting to waver around the edges, and Peterson was beginning to look like a man who'd just realized he might have walked into a trap. I'm going to call a 15-minute recess, Judge Holbrook announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Counsel for both parties, I'd like to see you in my chambers immediately. The next 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Clara spent the time whispering frantically with Peterson, her confidence evaporating like water on hot pavement. Lucas had the good sense to look worried, probably realizing that his grand scheme was about to implode in spectacular fashion. The gallery buzzed with speculation and whispered conversations as people tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. When court reconvened, Judge Holbrook's expression suggested that the conversations in her chambers hadn't been particularly pleasant for Clara's legal team. Peterson looked like he'd been run over by a truck, his earlier confidence replaced by the kind of defeated resignation that lawyers get when they realize they've been outmaneuvered by someone smarter than they thought. After reviewing the additional evidence presented by Mr. Harrington, Judge Holbrook announced, and considering the complex nature of the asset transfers and corporate restructuring that has taken place, this court finds that the marital assets available for division are significantly different from what was initially claimed. Clara's face went pale as she began to understand that her grand victory was turning into something else entirely. The assets she thought she was claiming, the business, the accounts, the real estate, had been legally restructured in ways that put them beyond her reach. The estate she wanted was locked in an untouchable family trust. The company she thought she was inheriting was now a shell corporation with minimal value. What remained for division was exactly what I'd planned to give her from the beginning. Enough money to start over, but not enough to destroy me. It was justice with a sense of humor, and it was about to teach Clara and Lucas exactly what happens when you try to outsmart someone who's spent his entire life building things that last. The trap was sprung, and there was nowhere left for them to run. The moment Judge Holbrook's gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Clara sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her face cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally the dawning horror of someone who'd just realized they'd been played by a master. Lucas looked like he'd been sucker-punched by reality, his dreams of business empire crashing down around his ears faster than a controlled demolition. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked over to where Clara was still sitting in stunned silence. Her high-priced attorney was shuffling papers like he could somehow reorganize the facts into something more favorable, but we all knew the game was over. Peterson's $1,500 an hour legal expertise had just been schooled by small-town strategy and old-fashioned preparation. "Clara," I said quietly, leaning down so only she could hear me over the courtroom commotion, "I've got a proposition for you." She looked up at me with eyes that held more venom than a rattlesnake convention, but she was listening. When your grand scheme implodes in front of half the town, you tend to pay attention to exit strategies. $800,000 in cash, I continued, my voice steady and businesslike. Clean break, no strings attached, no further claims on any Harrington assets. Take it and walk away, or spend the next 5 years in court chasing assets you'll never be able to touch, racking up legal bills that'll eat whatever settlement you might eventually get. The beauty of the offer was its simplicity. After all the legal maneuvering, asset restructuring, and corporate shell games, what remained of our marital assets was exactly what I'd planned to give her from the beginning. Enough money to start over somewhere else, but not enough to destroy what I'd spent 20 years building. Clara's lawyer tried to object, started spouting something about appeals and asset recovery, but Clara held up a hand to silence him. She might have been a lot of things: scheming, unfaithful, greedy as a casino owner, but she wasn't stupid. She could do the math as well as anyone, and the numbers didn't look good for prolonged legal warfare. After a 15-minute recess where Clara and Peterson huddled in increasingly heated whispered conversation, they returned with the kind of defeated resignation that comes from realizing you've been outplayed by someone you underestimated. The settlement was agreed to, signed, and filed before the courthouse closed that afternoon. Lucas's situation was even more satisfying to watch unfold. As my business partner, he was entitled to a buyout of his shares in Harrington Development Group, but those shares were now worth about as much as a chocolate teapot, since the real value of the company had been transferred to Harrington Holdings LLC, where Lucas had no ownership stake whatsoever. His partnership buyout came to just over $50,000, barely enough to cover his legal fees, and certainly not enough to fund the grand business empire he'd been planning with Clara's settlement money. The client list he'd been so eager to steal? Protected by non-compete agreements and contractual obligations that would take years to unravel. The business relationships he thought he could leverage? Built on trust and reputation that evaporated the moment word got out about his role in the conspiracy. Within 2 weeks of the settlement, Lucas found himself persona non grata in Wyoming's construction industry. Turns out that in small communities, word travels fast about people who betray their partners and sleep with their wives. No reputable firm would touch him with a 10-foot pole, and the few contractors desperate enough to consider hiring him couldn't afford his services anyway. Meanwhile, Clara and Lucas tried to make a go of their grand romance and business partnership, but reality has a way of killing romantic dreams faster than a bucket of cold water. Clara burned through her settlement money trying to launch some half-baked consulting business with Lucas, convinced that their combined expertise would be enough to build a new empire from scratch. 6 months later, their business had collapsed under the weight of their own incompetence and the industry's collective cold shoulder. Turns out that knowing how to betray people isn't the same as knowing how to build something lasting, and their relationship didn't survive the stress of financial failure and mutual recrimination. Clara ended up moving back to Denver, taking a job with some corporate consulting firm where nobody knew about her failed attempt at grand larceny. Lucas slunk off to Arizona or Nevada, somewhere far enough away that he wouldn't have to face the people he'd tried to screw over. Last I heard, he was working for some strip mall contractor, designing storage units and mini-marts instead of the hospitals and schools he used to dream about. As for me, Harrington Development not only survived the attempted coup, but thrived in ways I never expected. Turns out that when you remove the dead weight of disloyal partners and scheming spouses, a business can grow faster than weeds after a spring rain. Within a year, we'd landed 3 major contracts that Lucas had insisted were beyond our capabilities, and our reputation for integrity and reliability made us the go-to firm for clients who valued honesty over flash. I rebuilt the main cabin at the family estate, expanding it to include a proper guest house where my nephew's kids could stay when they came to visit during summers. Teaching those kids to ride horses, mend fences, and understand the value of honest work became one of the most satisfying parts of my new life. There's something deeply gratifying about passing on real values to the next generation, especially when you've just finished dealing with people who had no values at all. The irony wasn't lost on me that Clara's attempt to steal the family legacy had actually strengthened it. The estate was now protected by legal structures that would keep it in Harrington hands for generations, and the business was more successful than it had ever been when I was distracted by trying to make a failing marriage work. Tony Vega became my new business partner, bringing the kind of loyalty and work ethic that had been missing from my professional life for longer than I cared to admit. Martin Kane helped restructure our finances in ways that provided better security and growth potential than anything we'd achieved during the Lucas years. Rick Dalton became our exclusive equipment supplier, proving that friendship and business success aren't mutually exclusive when you're dealing with people who have your back. Friday night poker games resumed their sacred status, but now they were celebrations of survival rather than therapy sessions for dealing with stress. We'd sit around that same kitchen table, drinking beer and solving the world's problems, while I reflected on how much better life became once I stopped trying to hold together relationships with people who were actively working against me. The lesson Clara and Lucas learned the hard way was one I'd known all along from 20 years in construction. The foundation determines everything. Build on solid ground with honest materials and skilled craftsmen, and your structure will last for generations. Build on lies, deception, and betrayal, and everything collapses eventually, usually taking the builders down with it. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't destroying the people who betray you. It's refusing to be destroyed by them. It's building something so solid, so well-constructed, and so deeply rooted that their attempts at sabotage only make it stronger. Clara and Lucas thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers, but they never understood that I was actually building something designed to outlast whatever games they wanted to play. Sometimes the smartest move is letting your enemies defeat themselves while you focus on what really matters: legacy, integrity, and the satisfaction that comes from knowing you built something worth protecting.